What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? The 2030 Project is a podcast series that will explore why poverty persists and what we can do about it. We endeavour to uncover what has been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, and then what needs to come next. The 2030 Project will tackle some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing Canada today. But why now? Why launch this series in 2021?
Well, there's a number of reasons. First is because of the need. The pandemic has exacerbated the divide, and it's shown all of us that too many in our country were living too close to having to make use of a food bank. And we've gone through a really difficult time.
Neil Hetherington is the CEO of Daily Bread Food Bank. Now, besides providing food basics for those most in need, Daily Bread Food Bank is a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty.
We've had this shared experience of the pandemic and seen food bank usage rise dramatically, almost by double. There are solid solutions across the country. There's a poverty reduction strategy at each level of government that needs the leadership to be implemented. And we want to tell the individuals who are listening to this about what can be done and just how important it is. And enough is enough. We need to do something about it.
But is simply talking about the problem enough?
Poverty is an issue that can't be outsourced to charities. It's a public policy issue.
Talia Bronstein is the Vice President of Research and Advocacy at Daily Bread.
Having these discussions and looking to see what are the policy levers that can actually address these root causes, the income inequality, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of decent work. These are the true issues that are producing food insecurity, and these are what we need to tackle if we want to actually make sure that people don't need to come to a food bank.
Welcome to the program. I'm Dave Trafford. I sat down with Neil and Tahlia to explore some of the ideas and solutions offered intended to cut poverty rates in half before the end of this decade. But we've been talking about it for a long time, long before the pandemic hit us. So what makes Neil confident that anyone is going to do anything that in any way will have a measurable positive effect?
You're right. We've been talking about this, and Talia's right that the solutions are very clear. They are there is a whole host of social policy recommendations that are evidence-based that would make a difference. So why now? Why would we? Is this the opportunity to make a change? I think for me, what I'm hoping and sort of cleaving to is the opportunity is now and here because so many people have seen and gone through the experience together. Individuals who were gainfully employed lost their positions right away and had to turn to alternative sources of income. People who were able to pay their rent on a regular basis saw that the need for affordable housing, it became a little bit closer to home. And so my hope is that having gone through this, that hearts and minds will have changed so that they, when it comes to the ballot box, will make decisions that will be in the best interests of all Canadians and see those three things that we are advocating strongly for, those three buckets of affordable housing, of income supports, and of decent employment, that those would all come to fruition. So that's why I'm hopeful. We've gone through something together. Hopefully we've learned from it, and to repeat the too often said phrase that we'll build back better.
Biggest problem, though, when we start to have this conversation sometimes, Talia, is I notice this when I get on the radio show and talk about it. Immediately, people will start to text me and say, "We can't afford this. We've already spent enough money. Where is all this cash going to come from?" What we don't look at, I think, closely enough is that there's a real cost, and a significant cost to poverty. Here in Ontario, I've seen numbers that suggest it could cost us as much as $33 billion a year. That's a staggering amount of money. So when we begin to put it in terms of fixing or finding solutions, we really do need to kind of get to the ROI at this level. And I think that probably hasn't been articulated enough.
Yeah, my background is in public health, and I think the exact same sort of mentality applies here. In public health, we're always talking about upstream interventions. You know, if you can vaccinate someone, for example, they're not going to land in the ICU with a COVID infection and the complications that result. That ICU bed costs an incredible amount of money per day. I'm so incredibly grateful it exists, but we want to avoid using it if we can. The same thing goes for poverty reduction. If we can invest upstream, if we can prevent poverty from happening to begin with, there's all sorts of cost savings down the road in terms of healthcare utilization, justice costs. Once people have more complex challenges resulting from poverty, mental health costs go up. So there's all sorts of challenges that arise when someone experiences poverty, that if we can invest early and prevent that from happening for people, we're actually going to see cost savings. So really it's about, it's not necessarily do we have the money to do this, it's whether we can afford not to and whether we have the right priorities to make it happen.
Well, Neil, when you start talking about that kind of cash, that's a very large budget for any one ministry in this province. And it just occurs to me, do we, to make the point, rather than have a ministry of social services, do we not perhaps need a ministry of poverty reduction?
I think we do. We've got a poverty reduction strategy. We just need to implement it. It needs to be coordinated around all three levels of government who are paying the price. As Talia spoke about, it costs about $115,000 a year for an individual in a jail cell. It costs $60,000 plus for an individual in a shelter. You think about that versus what would it cost to decently house that person? It's an enormous savings, but why isn't it done? Well, often because those costs, a bit is borne by the province, some is federal, some is municipal. And so it becomes I can't afford to do it at my level of government. So I would love to see both state, city, and federal anti-poverty reduction strategy that's coordinated among all three levels of government.
Well, and then we begin with, 10 provinces, 3 territories, and all of a sudden that matrix gets pretty complicated. So how do we... This is lots of worms in the can here, Talia. And I think at some level, when we confront it that way, it's easy to understand why people would say, I'm exhausted. I can't push this rock up the hill anymore. So where do we need that voice and the leadership to cut through there?
I think that, it's so important to have that coordination because we need that local responsiveness, because the context in a city like Toronto is very different than the context in Yellowknife or the context in a rural community. So having that coordination between levels of government to be reflective of that local context while also making reaping the benefits of kind of national level funding and resources is absolutely critical. And I think, where people get really sort of, oh my God, where do we even start? I think the important thing to remember is that we've actually made some really significant progress. So we have reduced poverty for seniors. We have reduced poverty for children in really significant ways due to federal income supports for the most part. So we have a lot of successes that we can celebrate, that we can build on. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, and that's okay. But we need to, be on that journey. We need to be taking those, very clear targeted steps and putting one foot in front of the other to get to that end game.
Yeah, I guess so. And so who lights the path for us then? That really is putting one foot in front of the other is great, Neil, but we need to kind of know where we're starting and how we're getting to that end point. And, whether that's political leadership, whether that's private sector leadership, whether it's nonprofit charity leadership, somebody has to light the way and create that path for us.
Well, on a positive note, there have been strategies developed, and there is a solid federal poverty reduction strategy in place. It will get implemented when leadership at the political level, the duty bearers, the individuals who have the duty to make sure that people's right to food and people's right to housing, take that seriously. When will that happen? That will happen when the person that's listening to this podcast right now has a conversation with their colleague or their friend or their relative and said, this is important work for us as a country to do. It makes sense for us to do this. From a financial perspective, it makes radical common sense. From a values perspective, it just makes sense that we do this. So I think that there is the plans in place. It's around making sure that the leadership is there and executing it, and they'll do that if they know that their job depends on it.
You know, Talia, one thing that the pandemic illustrated for me was, and you know, we always heard it, but how fragile the income of most Canadians actually is. That is almost a hand-to-mouth thing where they couldn't go 3 weeks without a paycheck. And all of a sudden, and you guys saw that immediately in demand. So on the one hand, the federal government got great praise, and I think rightly so, for implementing CERB and doing so quickly. And they got cash into people's pockets, and that was a great thing. And so to some degree, it illustrates the benefit of having that income support moving forward. Whether or not that's the plan we want to adopt, at least we can point to the evidence and say, that kind of there's something positive out there. On the other hand, you're going to get immediately people will complain and say, well, that just gave people a reason not to work. So we're going to have that double-edged sword, but I think we need to be able to have conversations about a multiple view of solutions or tools in the toolkit to get this done. There will not just be one solution here to solve poverty. So basic income, for example, will be part of the conversation, but it can't be the only part of the conversation.
Yeah, one of my favorite phrases is that income is necessary but not sufficient to eliminate poverty. So we absolutely need to be addressing income supports. That's our social safety net, right? That's what happens when you lose your employment or if you're not able to work, because we also have to remember that not everybody is going to be able to enter the workforce or stay in the workforce for very valid reasons. And so we also need an income support system that makes sure that every Canadian can live with dignity, can afford their basic needs, and not face a situation where they have to access a food bank or be in precarious housing. But at the same time, we need that multifaceted approach, because we know that these inequalities, we can see it across communities. We know that discrimination and racism have a role to play. We know that individuals living with disabilities face much greater barriers. And so income supports are important, but we also need to address those fundamental societal challenges and systemic barriers that people face. And that takes a much broader kind of approach.
Well, yeah, that's getting into people's heads then, Neil. I mean, when we talk about people's reaction, there's a certain reaction that we would have to somebody who is on disability or who has to require, government assistance, that we look at them as others. And so it's easy to dismiss them and put them off to one side and think, oh, you're getting enough of my money.
It's unfortunate. I've been working in the poverty reduction arena for most of my career. And in that time, I have yet to meet an individual who is choosing to be on disability, or is choosing to be on OW, or in Ontario Works Welfare. These are individuals who are not making that choice. They are also that wild misconception that they're gaming the system or getting rich on that. The average person on welfare is getting about just over $700 a month. I don't know how they survive other than through their own fortitude and creativity. How do they even survive on that? Somebody on disability, around $1,100 a month. So I am hopeful that as the pandemic has reinforced for so many just the precarity that too many in the country are living with, that there is a more kind and gentle outlook to the individuals who are having these types of income supports, and recognizing just how very difficult it is to get by, and starting to change the mentality on that front.
Talia, how much of that stigma, though, is almost reinforced by unintended consequence by the system itself? Because it creates almost obstacles for people to lift themselves out of poverty or out of the circumstance that Neil describes.
Absolutely. It plays a huge, huge role. Our social assistance systems, a colleague of ours wrote a report, Noah's on, that said that the social assistance system has more in common with the corrections system, the justice system, than with a social program, because people are heavily monitored and policed and are constantly required to report on basically every aspect of their lives. It's a really undignified experience. It's an experience that makes people, feel that they have done something wrong, that they, cannot be trusted. When in fact, people, when they are given, the flexibility and the freedom to make decisions that work for them, they're going to make the best decisions for themselves, as we all would. So having that trust is something that our system really needs to build in. And I think that's one of the arguments why people are very interested in a basic income, which I know we're going to get into later on in this series, because I think it's an important discussion to be having in the poverty reduction space. As you said, it's not a silver bullet solution, and there's some downsides to it that need to be explored. But I think fundamentally what we're missing in our income support system is dignity.
Neil, that's one of the three pillars in the federal plan around poverty reduction. We're talking about dignity has to be, considered. The opportunity and inclusion is the second one, and the third one being resilience and security. Are you confident when we look at the government investing, I think it's $22 billion between 2015 and 2018 in this plan, and originally they were talking about 50% reduction by 2030. Given what we've gone through in the last 18 months, do we need to recalibrate those objectives? Because clearly we've just dug a much larger and deeper hole.
Well, I believe in the pillars of the plan. They're strong. We think just repeating them: dignity, getting individuals to make sure that their basic needs of their right to housing, their right to food is realized. Making sure that there's opportunity for folks to be participating in the economy. And then the resilient side of things. And I think that's where we really saw a lack of when the pandemic hit. And you mentioned it already. It was 2-3 weeks into the first lockdown of 2020 that the lineups at food banks were around the corner. And that was a great surprise to me, and I think some of my colleagues here, that it happened so quickly. So the pandemic did dig a deeper hole for many people, and this recovery is going to be incredibly challenged. If you think about the number of individuals who were facing evictions, and they're still facing that, and maybe the amount of rent is even more substantial now that is owed. So there's debt that's been incurred during this time by many people, And at the same time, we need to look at the disparity in the economy and ask the question, why have others done so well during the pandemic, where their finances have gone up tremendously? They've been able to save money. They've been able to make money on stocks. And yet for too many, it's been the adverse and the opposite has occurred. So it's a long way forward. I think the pillars are appropriate. Perhaps the funding to support the pillars is what we need to be boosting.
We started this conversation, Talia, by asking Neil why he thought this was important. Let's close this by asking you why you think this project is important.
I think that now is a really pivotal time because, these were issues before the pandemic, but they have been so exacerbated and brought to the forefront that I think that people are willing and ready to be the advocates that, put poverty reduction to the forefront. And we know that there's going to likely be a federal election in the coming months. I know in Ontario, we have an election scheduled as well. We have a municipal election in Toronto scheduled for next year. So, these are the pivotal times where your voice makes a difference. You have the opportunity to ask elected officials, what are you going to do to reduce poverty in your community in this country? So I hope that, people feel really empowered. The government at all levels have been incredibly responsive over the pandemic. And it's really shown us that when there is political will, there can be really swift movement on policy change. And so I hope that we carry that forward post-pandemic to say, we recognize, we see what these issues are, and let's take some steps to address these challenges in our society. It's not going to be an overnight change, but we can actually make really concrete changes and impact quite swiftly when there is that public will and political will.
Well, there was a lot in that 20-minute session, and we have just set the table. So in the next 10 episodes, we will take a deeper dive into the issues and the ideas that Neil and Tahlia have talked about. In the next episode, we'll start with the positive notes. There are solutions. There are robust plans that are already in the works. So we'll assess them through the eyes and the experience of those who are on the front lines of delivery services and support to Canadians living in poverty. Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is an Eye Contact production.